Before we begin, ask yourself, what happens when a child becomes emperor, not a general, not a scholar, but a boy? 14 years old, dressed in silk, surrounded by voices calling him divine. What happens when that boy stops believing in kings and starts believing he's a god? If you're drawn to the forgotten corners of history where belief, power, and identity collides, subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell stories, we uncover them. Now step into the firelit shadows of Rome and meet Elagabalus, the emperor who broke every rule. He came from the east, from Syria, brought to Rome by the will of two powerful women, his mother and grandmother, Julia Soemius. Julia Misa, names lost in most histories but in their time feared and unstoppable. The boy they elevated was barely a teenager. Quiet, mysterious, different. He dressed with intention, spoke in symbols, and worshipped a god unknown to Rome, Elagabalus, the sun deity of his homeland. To the Senate, he was a stranger. To himself, he was sacred. When Elagabalus arrived in Rome, he came not as a conqueror, but as something stranger. His robes shimmered in colors never seen in the Forum. His hands carried incense. He built altars to his foreign god, replacing Jupiter and Mars with something unfamiliar. He didn't claim divine right. He claimed to be divine. Temples were constructed, ceremonies rewritten. Sacred black stone symbol of his god was carried through the streets like a living relic. Some called it bold, others blasphemy. But no one stopped him, because behind the boy stood power. And behind power, silence. The emperor began to redefine everything. He changed how he dressed, how he was addressed. He insisted on rituals that left even his closest allies confused. He said Rome had misunderstood the gods. The joy was sacred. That devotion came through beauty, celebration, and personal transformation. He believed that, to serve the divine, he had to become the divine. And as Rome watched, stunned and silent, the empire began to shift. Each day brought new ceremonies, new expressions. The palace no longer echoed with military plans or policy. It became something else entirely. A sanctuary of devotion, expression, and identity. Elagabalus welcomed voices others ignored. He challenged what an emperor should look like, how power should sound, and what Rome could tolerate. But even in celebration, there was a darker tone. Because Elagabalus wasn't just experimenting with appearance, he was searching for something beyond the flesh, beyond the crown. He asked philosophers about transformation. He questioned priests about the soul. He spoke of becoming more than mortal. Whispers spoke of late-night rituals, sacred chambers, and hidden practices. Of a ruler chasing something eternal. He believed the gods were not distant. They were within, and he was proof. But Rome was not ready. The Senate grew quiet. The generals grew distant. People confused. They had seen war. They had seen corruption. But they had never seen this. Not rebellion, not invasion. But change radical and personal from the very heart of the empire. Elagabalus stood at the edge of two worlds. Ancient Rome, steeped in order and tradition, something new, unpredictable, fluid, fierce. His rule was short, but his impact unforgettable. Some saw him as a visionary, others as a danger. But even his enemies admitted, he had reshaped the role of emperor forever. And when his time ended, Rome exhaled. The temples were restored, the rituals rewritten, but something had changed. A line had been crossed, not in war, but in identity. And history remembered not just the policies or the parades, but the flame he lit. Because Elagabalus wasn't a ruler of Rome, he was a mirror, and what Rome saw could never unsee. This is the story of Elagabalus, the last of the Severian dynasty and the first Antonine emperor. When he came to power, he was just 18 years old. Many believed he would become a great emperor. Instead, he plunged Rome into crisis. By the time he turned 15, he had already left deep cracks in the foundations of Roman tradition. In the empire, it no longer knew whether to laugh, fear, or fall silent, because this was no longer just a reign, it was a shift. A transformation so unsettling that even marble walls seemed to remember. He challenged the gods themselves. He declared Jupiter, Rome's highest deity, subordinate to his own eastern sun god. He conducted ceremonies in public that no emperor had dared attempt. He reinterpreted oaths. He redefined rituals. He even brought Rome's most sacred figures into his personal beliefs, claiming unity between the old and the new. The Senate voiced its concerns. The people watched in disbelief. But Elagabalus believed he was fulfilling a destiny, one not rooted in tradition, but in transformation. The imperial palace, once a place of strategy and governance, now resembled a vast sanctuary of ceremony. There were gatherings that stretched for days, luxurious celebrations where identity, status, and decorum blurred into one long procession of splendor. Yet beneath the layers of gold and incense, the atmosphere grew heavier. Not all who attended were willing participants. Decisions once guided by law now stemmed from emotion, impulse, and symbolism. Elagabalus had begun to make decisions that reached beyond the council chambers. Those in his inner circle learned that missteps, no matter how small, could carry great consequences. A glance, a whisper, a misunderstood gesture. Any one of them might draw attention and retribution. Those who disagreed with his vision often found themselves distanced, their influence quietly erased, their names no longer spoken in the halls of power. In the emperor's eyes, these were not punishments. They were rituals, acts of purification. A new kind of Rome was being born, not through conquest or reform, but through personal evolution. But even gods, imagined or otherwise, require loyalty. And Elagabalus was beginning to lose his. His grandmother, Julia Misa, one of the architects of his rise, observed the change in silence. She had once fought to place him on the throne. Now she saw the empire straining under the weight of his choices. The Senate grew distant. The Praetorian Guard, protectors of the emperor, began to murmur behind closed doors, not because of belief, not because of dress or tradition, but because of instability. Rome had endured many things, but what it feared most was unraveling. The emperor's gatherings became grander. He filled fountains with scented water, surrounded guests with rare flowers, let wild animals roam freely during meals, and introduced rituals drawn from faraway lands. What once shocked, now exhausted, even those closest to him struggled to keep pace. He sought knowledge that others avoided. He questioned what it meant to lead. He dreamed of becoming something more than human, not through power, but through transformation. There were whispers of physicians summoned in secret, of questions asked that no ruler had ever dared voice. Could the body change as the spirit had? Could he transcend identity itself? These were not matters of politics, but deeply personal. But in a city built on custom and hierarchy, even private transformation became public concern. The empire watched. Amisa, she began to move. She understood Rome in ways her grandson did not. She knew that whispers could carry more weight than swords. And so she turned her attention to another, a young cousin, measured, reserved, named Severus Alexander. He was everything Elagabalus was not. Quiet, traditional, easier to understand, and soon easier to support. The Senate approved. The military took notice. Even the palace guards began shifting their loyalties. And all the while, the emperor continued, unaware or unwilling to see what stirred behind the veil. He believed he was untouchable, that devotion was enough. But in Rome, reverence fades when the foundation begins to crack. By the end, the tension could no longer be contained. Behind palace doors, plans were whispered, not of rebellion, but of replacement. In Rome, it was ready. Elagabalus had only one act left, one final chapter. The curtain was falling, but legends rarely fade quietly. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and watch another. You are watching this report from Rome, the year 221 AD. By the close of 221 AD, a strange stillness had settled over the empire. Elagabalus still sat on the throne draped in silk, layered in pearls, but the silence surrounding him had changed. No longer adoration, no longer awe. Now it was observation, because Rome was tired of spectacle, tired of mystery disguised as law, tired of waking each morning to declarations drenched in incense and drama. And behind him, quiet, poised, and gaining power, stood Severus Alexander, young, measured, unassuming, everything Elagabalus was not. The shift in power was subtle. Coins bearing Alexander's image began to circulate. Senators sought his opinion. The imperial guard started addressing him with titles once reserved for emperors. And Elagabalus, still wrapped in ritual and comfort, seemed either unaware or unwilling to believe that Rome could move forward without him. But Julia Misa, his grandmother, believed otherwise. She had once built him into a ruler. Now she quietly began to unbuild him. Elagabalus began to sense the change. Paranoia crept into his voice. He tried to strip Alexander of authority, dismissed his advisors, spoke publicly against him. But the empire had already chosen, the Praetorian Guard had already turned, the Senate had already stepped away. The end was no longer a question, it was only a moment waiting to arrive. One morning, the emperor made a final attempt to assert control. He summoned the guard, demanding that his cousin be arrested. He raised his voice. He issued threats. But the guard did not move. The emperor, once treated as sacred, untouchable, stood alone. And then, without warning, they turned. Not in anger, not in haste, but with the certainty of a decision already made. He was escorted out of the palace, stripped of authority. He clung to his mother, his final ally. But the future had already shifted. The city had moved on. And the guard followed orders not born from loyalty, but necessity. Elagabalus, no longer emperor, no longer divine, was removed from the world of marble and incense he had created. His life ended not with ceremony, but with conclusion. No royal honors followed, or eulogies whispered in sacred halls. His name was not preserved. His legacy was not defended, but remained with silence. There were no statues, no processions, no public mourning. His body was discarded, his memory buried, not in reverence, but in rejection. But history rarely forgets so easily, because Rome, so skilled at rewriting its past, struggled with this chapter. A chapter not marked by conquest or diplomacy, but by transformation, by disruption. Elagabalus had reshaped the palace, not with war, but with ideas. And while those ideas were soon dismantled, they left behind a shadow. Temples dedicated to his god were dismantled, laws he had passed were quickly repealed. Coins bearing his image were melted, and the echoes of his rituals faded into myth. But not everything disappeared, because Rome had looked into a mirror and seen itself altered. It had broken norms, challenged identities, and unsettled a civilization built on order. And when he fell, he left behind not just silence, but precedent. Julia Misa lived on, guiding the next emperor, quietly, strategically, just as she had before. The empire resumed its rhythm. But something had changed. Because no matter how many laws were rewritten or names were erased from marble, some stories, some changes simply refused to stay buried. This has been your host from Rome. This is the end of part 3. Thank you so much for watching. The boy emperor was gone. His body vanished in the river. His name erased from monuments. But what Rome had witnessed could not be forgotten. Elagabalus had not simply worn a crown. He had lifted a veil. He had exposed something the empire didn't want to see, how thin the thread was between ceremony and madness, between devotion and performance, between the sacred and the grotesque. In the quiet aftermath, Rome tried to breathe again. Julia Misa, the architect of this divine experiment, placed a new boy on the throne, Severus Alexander, composed, reserved, agreeable. The temples reopened. The senators resumed their routines. The city exhaled, but the memory remained. Not in books, not in speeches, but in sensation. That brief stretch of time when the palace had ceased to rule and had begun to perform, historians labeled it a disgrace. They painted Elagabalus as a warning, an aberration. But the truth, buried beneath layers of shame and laughter, was far more complex. He was indulgent, yes. He was absorbed by pleasure, obsessed with transformation. But he had also been alone. A child placed on a throne, not by merit or war, but by calculation. Told from birth that he was divine, raised without question, fed not with guidance, but with incense and applause. He believed what they told him. And that perhaps is the most dangerous belief of all. There was cruelty in his reign. But it was not always calculated. Much of it came from confusion, from unbound power given too soon to someone too unready. His rituals were not just for show. They were his language. And the empire didn't know how to respond. The discomfort surrounding Elagabalus isn't simply about his actions. It's about how close he came to shifting the core of Rome. Had his reign lasted longer? Had he kept control of the guard? Had Julia Misa hesitated just a little more? The empire might have changed forever, not through conquest, but through transformation. He brought foreign gods into the center of Roman life, not as guests, but as rulers. For a brief time, they didn't just visit Rome. They sat on its throne. And Rome, proud, stoic, stubborn, nearly accepted it. In the centuries that followed, the empire would paint over his memory. His name became a joke, his reign a footnote, the reality lost beneath mockery. But truth has a way of lingering in quiet rooms and old scrolls, in the minds of those who study history not for comfort but for understanding. Because what Elagabalus demonstrated was not just indulgence. He revealed the soft spots in the foundation of empire, the places where myth takes root, where identity can be rewritten, redefined. He tested the limits of what it meant to rule, not with armies or edicts, but with sensation. His legacy isn't carved in stone. It lives in the atmosphere, a certain tension that still echoes when power tries to merge with the sacred. When identity becomes law, when ritual becomes government, Elagabalus didn't need temples to leave a mark. He didn't need battles to change the story. He altered the empire through presence alone. Rome would later try to ignore him, pretend he never existed. But the unease remained, the silent question never fully answered. What if he wasn't insane? What if what frightened Rome the most was how many were willing to follow him? His power didn't come from violence. It came from persuasion, from allure, from theater. And for a moment, it worked. The boy emperor had shown Rome that divinity could be performed. It unsettled the foundations of an empire built on claiming descent from gods. Rome had always been comfortable with its leaders being called divine, as long as they acted, looked, and behaved in the right ways. Elagabalus appended that. He made the divine seem human, and in doing so threatened to make the Romans seem all too real. If Elagabalus had been anyone else, history might have remembered him as a gifted actor. Instead, he became the cautionary tale of every tyrant's rise, a warning about unchecked indulgences and boundless whims. But perhaps that's where the true story lies, in the fact that Rome preferred a mythical past to a complicated present. Elagabalus didn't just blur the lines between God and man. He forced Rome to confront its own capacity for belief, its willingness to accept the divine, not on its own terms, but on his. His name vanished from records. Temples once built in his honor collapsed into silence. Marble statues were cast into the river, their faces broken. Rome did everything it could to erase him. But erasure is not the same as forgetting. It's for a brief moment Rome had believed in him. Belief once given doesn't disappear. It lingers. Even when it becomes shame. He ruled for only 4 years. Yet those years bent the empire in ways no war ever could. He did not govern through conquest. He didn't win battles. He didn't rewrite laws. Instead, he turned the act of ruling into something else entirely, something unrecognizable, something sacred and terrifying. The empire became a stage, each law a performance, each decree a ritual. Power didn't flow from the sword but from illusion, and when it all ended, what remained wasn't relief, it was exposure. Because Rome had seen itself without armor, Elagabalus wasn't remembered for his policies or speeches. He was remembered for what he reflected. He became a mirror, not just for emperors, but for civilizations. A reflection of what happens when power and desire blur. When divinity is claimed, not inherited. When identity ceases to be private and becomes public spectacle. He didn't want obedience. He demanded devotion. It's not loyalty, but reverence. He didn't desire to rule the empire. He wanted to redefine it, to turn it into something new, something that matched the image he carried within himself. And for a short time, succeeded. This is why he endures. Not for how he fell, but for how far he reached. Temples may crumble, statues may break, but memory flows like water, and some names refuse to sink. A boy dressed in silks, a voice that called itself divine, a throne surrounded by shadows and flame. These aren't just images, they're echoes, and the more time passes, the louder they seem to become. He was cast into the river, a final insult, a final gesture of disgust. But the river doesn't erase, it carries. And somewhere, beneath layers of mud and time, that story still moves. Rome in its pride tried to forget. But forgetting only fuels the mystery. And mystery always finds its way back. Its reign may have collapsed in blood and betrayal, but its message remains. That identity, unchallenged, can rewrite the rules. That devotion, once misdirected, can become its own tyranny. That spectacle, once welcomed, is hard to contain. What made him dangerous was not just what he did. It was how icily others followed, how quickly they adapted to the rituals, how willingly they watched. He offered them something strange, not power, not order, but transformation. And many were ready to take it, until they weren't, till the illusion cracked, until fear replaced fascination, and by then, it was too late. The empire recovered, but only on the surface. Deep down, the questions remained, the unease, the wondering what if he hadn't fallen? What if the transformation had completed? What would Rome look like then? Because his death ended a reign. But it also began something else, a warning, a myth, a memory wrapped in incense and silence. Today we speak his name not to praise it, but to examine it, to understand what it meant, what it still means, and why it was feared enough to be buried so violently. Because the past does not stay buried, it waits. And sometimes it returns in different forms. Here at Dark Hours Archive, we don't look away. We follow the stories others have hidden. We dig into the cracks. We sit in the shadows of power and ask the questions most are afraid to voice. If you followed us through this story, then you already understand. This was never just about an emperor. It was about something far older and far more familiar. The rituals, the masks, the transformation of flesh into symbol, of politics into prayer. It didn't end with Elagabalus. It just changed shape, and it still walks with us. In every leader who confuses worship with service, in every system that cloaks control in sacred robes, in every place where identity becomes a performance. So if you want to explore more of history's hidden chambers, dark, buried, uncomfortable truths, they're here waiting. Subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. New stories unfold each week, some long forgotten, others never told. And each one a reminder that the line between past and present is thinner than we think. Because some gods never truly leave. They just find new names.